Right, welcome everybody for one more session on AWS Solution Architect. In this particular session, we will be learning about a concept called as a VPC endpoints. Now we know that a VPC is used to create network on AWS cloud. Now what is a VPC endpoint? A VPC endpoints allows us to privately connect to a VPC to the supported AWS services. Okay, let me explain that with the help of a small image, and then it will be very clear to us. Now, let's say we have a VPC. Okay, let's consider this as VPC. Now, inside VPC, I have two subnets. This is subnet 1 and this is a public subnet. All right. Now I have another subnet. This is subnet 2 and this is a private subnet. Okay, now what all other components will be there? Now there will be internet gateway. Okay, with the help of internet gateway, if any user, okay, if he has to communicate with any of the resource which is there in this particular VPC, the request has to be routed through a internet gateway. Now let's say there is a EC2 instance in this particular public subnet. So user with the help of internet gateway, they can access this EC2 instance. Now let's say there is a EC2 instance here. Now this is a private subnet, right? Can this user access this EC2 instance? It is not possible. How he accesses it? Now what we need to do is that we need to create a NAT gateway, or else now let's say if this user wants to access this, first of all this user has to connect SSH to this server. From this server he can SSH to this server with a private network. Now if this needs to have an outgoing internet connection, then we need to have a NAT gateway. Now let's assume that there is a S3 bucket which is not part of this particular VPC. Okay, this S3 bucket is not part of this particular VPC. Then let's say if this particular EC2, if it has to store data in this S3, how it can communicate? Because it cannot directly communicate outside VPC, right? Now what has to happen? The request has to go through here either with the NAT gateway, and it has to go out of the public, and from the internet it has to communicate like this. This will be the flow, right? But again, it is using a public service. That means basically what? It is using a public IP for me, for my EC2 instance, which is there in a private subnet, to send data to S3. Okay. So this is again expensive, right? Because you're using public net, etc. So it is going to be very expensive. And it is not a good solution, right? It's a very complex solution. So now what AWS has bought in, they have a service called as a VPC endpoint. Now with the help of this VPC endpoint, this can privately connect with this S3 bucket if we create an endpoint. Okay, that is what the use of a VPC endpoint for a resource which is there inside a private subnet. If it has to communicate with other services, we can use VPC endpoint. Okay. Now again, what changes that we need to do? There will be a route table here, which is let's say a private route table. There will be a public route table here. Okay, all that you need to do is that just create a VPC endpoint and add this VPC endpoint to this route table. That is more than enough. This EC2 instance will get access to this particular S3 even if it is in a private sub. Okay, this is what the hands-on that we're going to do. So for the hands-on, I already have a VPC. Okay, I already created subnets. Okay, and I created two EC2 instances in each subnet. I created a NAT gateway. Okay, first of all, what I will show. So, and there is a AWS CLI installed on this particular server. First, let's connect to this EC2 instance. From this EC2 instance, I will SSH to this EC2 instance. Okay, and we will try to connect to S3. Okay, the how the connection will happen, it will not happen directly because there is no endpoint. It will go via like this outside web and it will connect to this. Once we establish that, we will remove the NAT gateway in the route table. In one of the route table, we have to add NAT gateway, right? We will remove this NAT gateway and then we'll try to access. We will not have access. And then we will create a VPC endpoint and then we'll directly connect here. This is the hands-on exercise that we're going to do. Let me shift to my AWS console for that. Now, if you look, I'm on my AWS console. Let us go to this VPC. Now, I already have created a VPC. Let me show you that. Okay, you see, I have two VPCs here. Let me go into these VPCs. You see, I have created a VPC by name VPC Endpoints. Now, let's see the details of this VPC. Okay, this CIDR range, remember this, it is 12.0.0.16. All right. Now, let me go to subnets. In the subnet, you see I have created two subnets. One is private subnet. You see one is public subnet here and one is private subnet. Now, if you look into the public subnet, okay, let's say route table in the subnet, you see there are two routes. One is local route, one is internet gateway. Okay, and let's go to the other subnet. Go to private subnet, and in the private subnet, if I go to route table, you will see two routes again. One is local, one is NAT gateway. That means both the instances will have a outgoing internet connection because we have created a NAT gateway. Okay. Now that is about subnets, route tables, and VPCs. If you see, there is also internet gateway assigned to this VPC endpoints. You can see this here. Now let us go back to the EC2 instances. Let me go to EC2 instances here. I have two instances. One instance is there in a private subnet. One instance is there in a public subnet. Let me click on the instances here. You see, one is EC2 public, one is EC2 private. Now, if I click on the public EC2 instances, if you come to the networking, you see the subnet that is assigned is public subnet. Similarly, for other EC2 instance, which is private, I have assigned a private subnet. Go to security. Sorry, go to networking. You can see there's a private subnet that is assigned for this. Okay. Now, first of all, let me connect to the public EC2 instance. From the public EC2 instance, I will connect to the private EC2 instance. All right. So let me select option connect. select option connect. Okay. I'm on my EC2 instance now, logged in as a root user, and then I'm there in a root folder. Okay. From this public instance, let me connect to the private instance. Let me go here, go back to the instances, choose the private instance. You see, this does not have a public IP address because it is not in a public subnet. So let me copy the private IP address. Instead of that, let me go to connect and select option sessions manager or SSH client. You see, this is how I connect SSH-I, the PEM name and the IP address of the server. Let me copy this. So this is the 10.0.2.237 is the private IP address. If we want, we can see here. I have copied this. Let me go to this instance. You see, this is the private IP address. Now let me go here and connect to that particular instance. Paste, enter. So basically it is saying that this PEM file is not accessible. Now if I see ls here, there is no file by this name. I have stored this file under home and a user Ubuntu. Okay, this is the home directory for the user Ubuntu. Okay, now let me run this here. Now you see, I am logged into the second server here. Okay, now here I have configured AWS CLI. Now let me see AWS S3 LS. You see, I'm able to see the buckets which is there in AWS. That means from the second server, with the help of NAT gateway, which is there in the public subnet, I'm connecting to the public, and from there I'm connecting to the S3 bucket. That means the request is going to public and coming back to AWS again. Now I don't want that, right? So we want to use VPC endpoint and configure that. Let me show you how to do that. Now, first of all, let me go to the private subnet. Let me go to the subnets and I will remove that rule of NAT gateway. Okay, I'm in the private subnet now. Okay, let me go to subnets. This is the private subnet. Now in this, let me go to the route table. You see, there is a NAT gateway rule. Okay, let me go to the route table to change that. Go to route table and this is the private route table. Edit routes and then remove this. Save changes. Now that means what? The second server, this server should not be able to communicate to the S3. Let me run this. Now you see, we will not be able to communicate because we have removed the NAT gateway. Okay. Then how to establish communication? I want to establish the communication by using VPC endpoint. Let me go to VPC. You see, if I scroll down, there is option called as endpoints. So there are two options, endpoint service and endpoints. What we need to look into is endpoints. Let me go here. Select option called as create a endpoint. Now let's name the endpoint. I'll give the endpoint name as demo. If you scroll down, you will see the service category. What type of endpoint is that? Is that a private link ready partner service, AWS market service, other endpoints, or AWS services? Let's choose AWS services. Now, if you come, there are a lot of options here. There are two types of endpoints that we'll discuss in a short. In short, so one is called as interface endpoint, another one is called as a gateway endpoint. Okay, now we are worried about gateway endpoint here. So now in this services, type in for S3. Okay, and enter. Now you see there is one gateway. So there is only two gateway endpoints. One is for S3, another one is for Amazon DynamoDB. Okay, only endpoints is available only for these two services. Interfaces are available for a lot of services like CloudWatch, SNS, etc. We'll understand that in a while. Now, first of all, let me choose S3. Now, this endpoint is for which VPC? This is for this VPC called as a VPC endpoints. And which route table that I need to associate with this? I want to associate the private route table because this is a route table which is there for a private subnet, and that is where our EC2 instance is there. All right. And then full access. If you want to give any custom access, we can mention the custom access. Let's go and select option called as create endpoint. Okay. Now the endpoint is successfully created. Now let me go to this EC2 instance. Okay. Now let me run this again. You see, I'm able to see the storage accounts. Now I have not connected this with NAT gateway, but I have connected this EC2 instance which is there in a private network, that is on a private subnet, with the help of a VPC endpoint. Okay, that is how we create EC2 and VPC endpoints. It's very easy. Configure a VPC endpoint, mention which VPC and which route table here. We don't use any public IP addresses here. All that we mention is only which route table, and then give the access, and that particular service will get access to the S3 buckets. All right. That is what it meant here. Allows you to privately connect your VPC to supported AWS services. All right. Now let us look into a couple of more features of VPC endpoint. A VPC endpoints enables customers to privately connect to supported AWS services and VPC endpoint services powered by AWS PowerLink. Now, how does a VPC endpoint work? It works with something called as AWS Private Link. Okay. Now, Amazon VPC instance does not require public IP addresses to communicate with resources of the service. Now, we saw in our hands-on exercise for the EC2 instance, which is there in a private network, it didn't have any public IP address. That is the one of the use cases of a VPC endpoint. It does not require public IP addresses to communicate with resources. Private IP address is more than enough. Traffic between an Amazon VPC and a service does not leave the Amazon network. So we have our EC2 instance and the S3 both on AWS network only. So traffic is not going out of AWS network and coming into AWS network. That is the major advantage of using a VPC endpoint. Now, how does it work? There are two things as we have learned. One is basically we have something called as a VPC gateway. So in the endpoint, we have two types of endpoints. One is called as a gateway endpoint. Second is called as interface VPC endpoint. These are the two types of endpoints that we have. So for a gateway VPC endpoint, it only supports two services. One is called as Amazon DynamoDB. Second one is called as Amazon S3. If you want to communicate with any of other services using VPC, we have to use something called as interface VPC endpoint. Okay. Gateway endpoint is for DynamoDB and S3. All other services, it is interface VPC endpoint. Now let us understand what is a AWS private link. AWS private link uses network load balancers to connect interface endpoints to the services. What does that mean? Now let's say our EC2 instance is connecting with AWS S3, right? How it is connecting? By using a AWS private link. It is nothing but a network. And this network uses network load balancer behind the screens. Now we know a network load balancer functions at network transport layer 4 and can handle millions of requests per second. Now in the case of AWS private link, it is represented inside the consumer Amazon VPC as a endpoint network interface. Now customers can create endpoint network interfaces in a multiple subnets mapping to multiple availability zones to make sure that service is resilient to an availability zone service description. Okay, that's in short about AWS private link. Okay, and about VPC endpoint. So the VPC endpoints, to summarize, VPC endpoints, there are two types. One is called as a gateway endpoint. Second one is called as interface endpoint. If you want any of the services which is there in a private subnet to communicate privately to VPC, if it is DynamoDB or S3, we can use a gateway endpoint. If it is any other service, we can use a interface endpoint. All right. Thank you for attending the session. You guys have a good time. Take care.